So what we're going to do today, and I welcome everybody who's here, our panelists who have agreed to speak and our participants who I am going to open it up once the panelists have had a chance to give some of their views. I'll open it up for all of you to be able to speak and interact. I asked for people to send some thoughts in about where they were on the day of 9/11. And many of us have very vivid memories of that day. We have with us today 7 people who are going to give us their perspectives, and some from the heart of what happened on 9/11. Part of this is to remember so that we never forget. Part of this is to pass on those memories, as you will see from our last presenter, somebody who doesn't remember the day, but remembers his life post the day, because he was just a wee lad at the time. So remembering, healing, learning, and passing on those memories, lest we never go there again. And so with that, let me introduce our speakers today. It's a special group of people that are associated and members of NSF. Ann Silver will talk to us first about her recollections from the North Tower. Charles Russo will give us his perspective from working close to the Pentagon. Kevin McCarthy will talk about what it was like to from the perspective of a pilot on that day, and shortly thereafter. Ted Morris will talk to us from his perspective on being on an Air France flight. Randy Thompson will share her perspective from being in a leadership training just outside Washington. Anthony will share a perspective of being away from the news feed that many people lived and breathed with. And Aidan Holting, our NSF podcast developer, will share his perspective from being not cognizant of what was happening on the day, but living with it for his entire life. So with that, these memories are very important to us as NSF, and they're important to the country, and I'm very grateful to our speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. This is only the second time I've actually publicly spoken about my experience on 9/11 as an employee who worked on the 9th floor of the North Tower, which was the first building that was hit. I remember the day vividly, and most of you have heard, I don't watch the movies or the videos, but it was a spectacularly beautiful morning in New York, very rare for New York City to look like Reno, Nevada, clear and sunny. And it was just a perfect day. And I was the senior vice president of human resources and labor relations for a large company that had offices in Midtown Manhattan as well as in the World Trade Center. And we were operating Windows on the World, the restaurant at the very top of the North Tower. It was rare for us to be open since it was mostly a lunch and dinner establishment, but we were open that morning for a seminar for Smith Barney. So we had a number of our employees working to produce that event, to prepare the meals, serve them, and help facilitate the meeting. I'd gone in early that morning and remember being at my desk, and I was actually facing west, and facing east, and actually heard the plane, heard it coming from a direction that it would not normally approach from, particularly as it made its way down the Park Avenue corridor of New York City, which is not accustomed to hearing planes or seeing planes fly so low. Basically, all I remember is this extraordinarily loud boom. And having then had a father who remembered a small plane hitting the Empire State Building in the 1930s, all I could think of was that a plane had gone astray from LaGuardia Airport or Kennedy Airport and hit the building. Immediately, there was a great deal of fuel from the plane flowing down the building, and suddenly we were encased in complete darkness, which was not so much a function of the electricity, but of the fuel covering the windows. As the head of human resources, it was my job to announce any emergency. And I quickly, literally ran around the office, which occupied an entire floor of the building, and said to people, get out, don't know what's going on. And people were getting very frightened. People were listening to the news and heard some reports that a plane had struck the building. There was no sense of what type of plane. It was certainly not in our vocabulary to think of a terrorist, but we were immediately ushered down the floor from the stairwell, which I'd never seen before. No one had ever taken the stairs up or down to the 9th floor. And so we were one of the first groups of people who made our way into the foyer of the North Tower. And simultaneously, we heard glass shattering in the foyer as unfortunately people were plunging to their deaths. And it was the first time I had ever seen a injured, dead body, several of them lying in and around the courtyard of the building. By the time we made it down, enough time had gone by, approximately 12, 13 minutes. I can't remember that the South Tower was hit. And by then, people were rather hysterical. It seemed as if we were in the midst of perhaps World War III. We were engulfed in smoke and paper and machinery and body parts. And I've put a lot of this out of my memory, but I can tell you that, and I'm sorry I get very worked up talking about this, I was suddenly aware that I might die, and that my family who lived in New York, and I was a New Yorker, born and raised, might die. And I was very concerned that I was going to die right there and never see my family again, my parents or my siblings, my wife, my husband, my daughter, my dog. It just all hit me that it would be the place I died. And I think if you've seen videos, which I refuse to watch, but if you've seen some of them, I've been told you can see this overwhelming smoke and billowing of a dark cloud that moved its way up the west side of Manhattan. And most of us took off our heels, our high heels, which we wore to work back then, took off our shoes and just ran. And I was a runner, and I remember thinking I had run about a mile at the point in which I turned around and saw the buildings implode. First one, I think it was the South Tower that imploded first and fell to the ground, and then the North Tower. And at that point, I was absolutely convinced I would die and never see my family, and that we were being attacked by some entity unknown. The terms Al-Qaeda and Taliban, the Mideast were not at the front of mind. There were people jumping into the Hudson River. There were people who were hysterical. Many people dodged into various retail buildings that occupied the corridor right out of the North Tower. And I was aware that by that time, we'd lost several hundred employees who were working the event at the windows on the World Restaurant. As I said, this is only the second time I've ever spoken to it. The first time was to a Carson City High School class, and most of those individuals barely were toddlers when this occurred. And when I do think about that event, I know how much it changed my life. It changed my life in the sense that while I lived and many perished, my family was safe. but I never thought of the world being safe again. I never thought of taking my life for granted or looking up at a clear blue sky in the morning or the stars at night and thinking something might not happen. It was 2 years to the day before I boarded a flight again. I still remain very afraid of flying for no particularly rational reason, just have a fear of boarding an airplane. And I do get flashbacks of the sound and the feeling of being in a building, being hit by a very large jet. I do get flashbacks of the sounds of screaming and the sounds of people dying and the sounds of people crashing through the atrium glass and falling to their deaths right in front of us. I do remember walking across bodies and perhaps what were body parts. And my father was still alive at the time, and telling him later that day, it reminded him of World War II and what he encountered. So I consider myself a survivor. I spent a year dealing with the Victims' Compensation Fund, the employees we lost, the widows, the widowers, the children who had lost parents, and working through a process of trying to heal. Obviously, our offices were relocated. What we did as a restaurant company is we then knew we had lost the opportunity to make any sort of revenue, which was not our first priority at that moment, but we realized the best we could do was to feed the first responders. And so for 7 months, most of us were occupied with making breakfast and lunch and dinner for thousands of workers. I am one of the lucky individuals who did not suffer from much of the poor air quality that many firefighters and first responders later filed claims for, who had breathed in the smoke and the detritus of the disaster. But we literally made sandwiches every day and did what we could to provide water and comfort and first aid and food to the first responders who were there for almost a year and then some. But as I said, I'm so happy to have survived, but I still mourn the loss of hundreds of people I knew. I'd worked in that building for many years. Below the trade towers was a very large mall where you could do everything from get your nails done, to get a haircut, to drop off your dry cleaning, to buy your groceries. And for all of us who were commuters, you usually went downstairs and took care of those things at lunch or after work. So there were many shop owners I knew, and people who were service workers or retail workers who also perished. And those above the crash lines of the two towers who never had a chance of leaving. The stairwells were blocked. It was completely dark. And obviously, once the buildings imploded and fell, people never had a chance of getting out. One last memory I'll share is that as a New Yorker, there were several newspapers operating at the time. And sadly, by that evening, papers were publishing visual images of people jumping out of the building. They had no choice but either to burn up or jump. And I always think back what I would have done. Would I have just stretched my arms out and tried to fly and hope that God or some force protected me? Or would I have perished in the fumes and the gas and the flames that were spreading both up and down the buildings? But there were visuals of individuals flying, and immediately there was so much public pressure to take those photos off the front page of the Daily News and the New York Post, because their widows or partners or children were able to identify those individuals, very often gentlemen, by the color of their tie or the type of their suit, or the women in their dresses. So that's an image I can't get out of my mind. And once again, I've never seen a movie, a newscast, a broadcast of any kind showing the towers, showing them falling, showing them being hit. It's something I don't need to recollect in any way. And now, 20 years later, I think we've all become more vigilant. Hopefully, despite the pandemic and a lot of the political rhetoric, we remind ourselves of how fragile we are and the tremendous humanity that was shown as a result of that event across the country. I heard from people all over the country for many years after that, and I'm still grateful to those who surrounded me and my family and helped us recover from what was a horrific event. So thank you for listening to my story as much as I feel comfortable sharing.
And thank you so much. That was hard to hear, and I'm very grateful for you being willing to share with us. I think it's important for all of us to remember. I too saw very little news footage, but that's another story. So thank you for sharing that. Charles.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you for also having, putting this together, I think does help not only ourselves as survivors of 9/11, but also, our society of not forgetting, but also understanding where we could be led in the future. So I had worked in Rosslyn, Virginia, which is right down the 110, about 2 miles from the Pentagon. I was a federal employee working for the Secretary of Defense Office of Personnel. Tuesdays, we made our courier runs. And it just happened that there was another coworker and myself who we switched off. And it just happened that she was running late. And our supervisor had said, you know what, let's just wait until the afternoon in order for you to take the shuttle from Rosslyn. We were really right next, we were on North Kent Street, next to back then the museum was over in Rosslyn. Working that day, hearing of what had happened in New York City. And then we had heard of course, subsequent crash into the Pentagon, I look back and go, wow, divine intervention that we had 2 coworkers. It could have been either one of us, and yet a supervisor had said, no, don't go. We're going to go in the afternoon to do a courier run. Our courier runs literally took us through every wing of the Pentagon. And whether it was dropping off paperwork or picking it up. I was also a Naval reservist attached to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Specifically, our unit was supporting the National Defense Intelligence College at the time. And so it just happened that also I not only worked in Rosslyn and the Pentagon was in the middle, but my apartment was on South Glebe Road in 395. And so once the Pentagon had been hit and they were evacuating pretty much all of Washington, D.C., Rosslyn became a parking lot. Cell phone service was non-existent. It was surreal. It really did have a feeling of what's going to happen next? Am I going to make it home? I was a father of 3 children. 2, of course, lived at home. 1 actually was at her elementary school, Hoffman, Boston, which is right not too far from back then the Navy Annex. Now it's the Air Force Memorial area. And my concern was trying, 1, to get to my kids and get home. And like I said, everything was really just a parking lot, no self-service, couldn't get a hold of my wife, couldn't get a hold of the kids. So I started actually to walk home, making my way to Fort Myers, to the gate, because that was going to be the most advantageous way to get home. We were blocked, even though we had military IDs, we had government IDs. Security forces, MPs had said, no, base was locked down. A group of us actually walked through Arlington National Cemetery because we started to make our way down to the 110, which ran between Rosslyn and the Pentagon to the 395. And doing that we're walking past just these vivid memories of here fallen, brothers and sisters from previous wars. We're hearing that it was a terrorist attack. My background had already been 10 years of doing anti-terrorism force protection for both Naval Criminal Investigative Service in the early 1990s to the mid 1990s to a US Navy Air Wing, where I did anti-terrorism force protection as well. So first and foremost on my mind, it was, this has got to be a terrorist attack. No qualification of understanding who is doing what. We hadn't even heard of the Shanksville plane yet, let alone any reports coming off of the planes from those individuals making phone calls. It took approximately 4 hours to get home, and finally walking to the very end of Arlington Cemetery and coming out at the brick wall just at the Pentagon and seeing the helicopters landing, the firefighters, the police, the military, the collapse of pretty much, right close to where, Maureen, you're sitting, just over your left shoulder. Exactly.
Right.
Knowing the layout back then of that was a helicopter pad over there, and that was an entrance for deliveries and hire executives, because they had a parking lot literally right behind you. And then finally walking down 395, literally a picture for those individuals knowing the Washington, D.C. area, and 395 as you come up to the Crystal City exits for the Pentagon. Imagine yourself walking down the freeway, and the only things coming in or out are emergency vehicles. Passing people and no smiles, no, I remember someone just trying to say hello and not having an emotion. And then finally making it home to my wife and my kids at the time. And then calling in for my reserve unit of what's going on, what do I need to do? Subsequently ended up getting recalled to active duty. Myself went to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where I was a briefer for the Afghan crisis cell. Very fitting. Our focus, of course, was the Taliban. And so what did it impact on my life was really, I never really thought I'd have a career doing counterterrorism, but now for the last, almost 32 years, really has been my focus. Not only did I move on to many of the three-letter agencies, retired from the FBI, from the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytics Center, but also went to work as a contractor for the agency, doing tip of the spear counterterrorism operations. And that was a catalyst. I can't say that my life, it is. It's hard for me to even vocalize what it only really made the catalyst of I need to be there for our safety and security. So really it ended up that my whole life became public service. And then even, 12 in Homeland Security, because it is a passion. It's something that those images of that day and then understanding what happened that day are seared in my mind. I have grown adult children and even now grandchildren who they know what happened on 9/11, but they have yet to even ask me. And I think having a forum such as this really does open that people should be asking questions of, well, where were you? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? Because I think we're going to be able to learn something from everybody. And I'm not saying Monday morning quarterbacking. So
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate your sharing that. And I imagine the walk through Arlington really put everything in perspective. One of my few memories of being above ground that day was seeing the smoke billow from the Pentagon. I'm not telling my story today, but I'm turning it to my brother, who can give you an idea of what was happening a little bit through my eyes and a lot through his eyes. So, Kevin.
Thank you, Maureen. And just to set the record straight, I am not a congressman.
No,
I'm the
you are
older,
not.
more honest version. Anyway, so on the morning of 9/11, I was sound asleep in bed. I was scheduled to fly the evening flight from Salt Lake to New York. And my wife very carefully guarded my absolutely strange sleep cycles. So I was asleep in bed and she was sitting at her desk in the house, and the phone rang and she grabbed it on the first half a ring, and it was Maureen calling. And she says, "Hey, an airplane just hit the tower. I need to talk to him." And Dee says, "He's asleep. He's going to fly all night." And hung up. So 15, 20 minutes later, Maureen calls back again and says, "Get him up. We got to talk. Second airplane's hit the tower." So Dee comes down and gets me out of bed. And I distinctly remember my first words. She tells me, "2 airplanes have hit the World Trade Center." And I said, "The world as we know it has changed." My background, in the early 90s, I had joined with a number of airline pilots across the industry to advocate for increased what we called AVSEC, aviation security. We were concerned about how we were protecting the airplanes, and we wanted something done, and we were going to lobby the government and the industry to improve things. So as a result of that, I had been designated as the security representative for the Airline Pilots Association in Salt Lake, where I was based, and had a real good relationship with the corporate security guy. And we were moving forward from there. Our group, by the summer of 2000, we had been really agitating. I mean, this is a group of about 15 people. And we had our annual meeting, and Time Magazine agreed to come cover our meeting to see what we were doing. And the gal said, "Hey, I need a good quote to start off this article." And we got together and said, "Okay, the next airliner we lose is going to be due to a breach of the cockpit door." Now, no, we did not think it was going to be terrorists. We thought it was going to be disruptive passengers turning into a brawl in the airplane. But our cockpit door was actually, and some of the airplanes actually was cardboard. I mean, you could put your foot through it. It wouldn't keep anybody out. And we figured, okay, there's going to be some rolling brawl in the back and we're just going to lose it. So the airline industry at that point in time said, "Yeah, those guys are a bunch of nuts." So back to the day, after waking up, I switch on CNN and see what's happening. And, oh my God. And so the next few hours become a complete blur for me. It's phone calls every which direction, people calling me. So the corporate security officer had been at a meeting in Atlanta that day, so he wasn't even here in Salt Lake. And computer systems are all down, overwhelmed. And he calls me and says, "Hey, we don't know if we might have to relocate our airplanes. If we're under attack, we're going to need to get our airplanes out of the major cities. Start putting together a group of guys to fly our airplanes out of Salt Lake, and we'll distribute them around the mountain airports, get them out of the way." So I was tasked with trying to find pilots to fly all these other airplanes. And since computers were down, had no way of knowing who was available, who was where. And it was calling people going, "Hey, are you willing, if required, report to the airport, take an airplane and go someplace?" And most of them said yes, but some of them said, "No way, Jose." So it was a difficult day. My flight, needless to say, to New York that day was canceled. That was Tuesday morning. And the National Airspace System was shut down. The message all of the US airplanes in flight got was land at the nearest suitable airplane immediately. And I literally knew the one very good friend was flying from Europe back to the US, and he looked out the window and said, "Well, there's Shannon Airport, Ireland, right below me." And he just put it into a dive and landed in Shannon. So everybody was all over the world. We had no idea where they were. My flight's canceled, and the airline is trying to figure out how are we going to get back together and get this back running. So by Thursday afternoon, the government says we're going to try and reopen the National Airspace System. And my chief pilot says, "Okay, hotshot, you ready to go back flying?" I said, "Sure." And my co-pilot, who was supposed to have gone with me on Tuesday, was still hanging around. And he said, "Yeah, I'm with you." So we said, "All right, we'll take a flight." And what are we going to do? How are we going to protect this airplane? So we found a quiet room and sat down and worked out a couple of ideas on how we might defend ourselves. What most of the world doesn't realize is that we have a very lethal weapon in the cockpit of the airplane. Right within reach of the captain is a crash axe, which is a very sharp axe on one end and a big spike on the back in case we have to cut our way out of the side of an airplane. So we're actually are fairly well armed. You take that and a fire extinguisher, and then the big decision is, okay, we later determined was that when you're in a situation like this, it's who flies, who fights. So, okay, hit fly, I'd fight. So we were ready to go. So we found an airplane. Now, the next trick was going to be to find a crew, because universally, all of the flight attendants who were not at work were not about to come to work. They said, "I don't care if you want to fire me, I'm not coming." So we're down in the flight attendant lounge in Salt Lake Airport, and there's a whole bunch of flight attendants who are stranded, and they will do anything to get back to the East Coast. So I find 4 of them. They go, "Yeah, we're willing to go with you." And now we have to create a manifest to legally have these people on the airplane. Well, coincidentally, one of the flight attendant schedulers from Atlanta was also stuck in Salt Lake. So he says, "Come on over here. I got a computer that works. I'll create the appropriate flight orders to put all these people together, and off you go." So now we got an airplane, we got a crew, and now we got to deal with the passengers. So we get out to our airplane, and my co-pilot gets on the airplane and briefs all of the flight attendants. And I said, "Well, I guess I'll go out in the gatehouse and meet the people that want to get on our airplane." So I go out and meet each and every one that's going to get on the airplane, and said, "Oh, hey, come on, we're going to keep you safe, but I'm going to ask you to stay put as much as you can in your seats the whole way. And if you got to get up and use the lavatory, you use the one in the back. Don't even think of walking towards the cockpit. And if anybody else is standing up in the aisle, you wait until everybody's sitting down." And I don't think anybody moved for the entire flight. So we get going, and turns out we're the first airplane to go into the National Airspace System. And dear God, was that a strange and eerie evening. We're the only airplane in sight. Air traffic control got nobody to talk to but us all the way across the country. So we arrive Dulles along about 10 o'clock at night and shake hands with the people getting off the airplane, and flight attendants say, "Hey, Cap, thanks for the ride. See you around." And they disappeared. I never saw them again. So we get our crap out of the airplane, and I get into the jetway, and my phone rings, and it's Maureen calling again. And she says, "You landed 10 minutes ago. We're right behind you all the way in."
I was calling from the phone outside the Situation Room. We had fighter jets on his wings the whole way in, and they told me I could reach out and call him and let him know that I knew he was in safe.
So I had no idea I had a target pinned to my back the whole way. And boy, was I glad I made a nice, stable approach into Dulles.
It was a long 4 hours.
Yeah.
We watched it carefully.
So we got in there, flight attendants disappeared, and the company called, said, okay, go get some rest. You're going back out flying tomorrow. Well, that didn't happen. As a matter of fact, it didn't happen for days. We couldn't get flight attendants to come to work. The company would say, hey, there's an airplane coming in, you've got 4 flight attendants on it. And they'd show up, and they had never gotten on the airplane, never came to work in Atlanta. We had no idea when we were going to get out of there. Finally, we're having trouble communicating throughout the system, and the chief pilot in Salt Lake calls me and says, just go out there and fire up that airplane and bring it back to Salt Lake. We got people in the West that'll fly. So we said, okay, we'll go out and grab it and just ferry the airplane home. Well, there's 150 passengers standing in the gatehouse trying to get out of Dulles. And obviously they weren't going with me with no flight attendants. There were also a bunch of trapped Delta Airlines employees there. And legally I could take Delta employees on the airplane up to, like, I don't know, 15 of them or something with no flight attendants. So I kind of carefully went around the room and found these people and said, hey, follow me over to this staircase and come on downstairs and walk out under the jetway where people can't see you, and go up the steps and get on the airplane, and we're leaving. And I have no idea what the employees that working the gate there in Dulles had to deal with the 150 people who want to get on my airplane. But we pushed back left and ferried the airplane back to Salt Lake and put it back into service. So, you know, it was a long, strange couple of days. And after that, the airline industry that had thought we were all a bunch of nuts said, hey, maybe those guys weren't as crazy as we thought they were. Get them in here. And I found myself appointed as Director of Intelligence and Emerging Threats for the Airline Pilots Association and for the industry. And my life really did change. But as I said, it was a career broadening opportunity. So a lot of things went down after that.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you sharing that very much. There was a lot of looking out for each other that day,
Well,
even if we didn't know it.
like Ann said, this is the first time I ever did this in public. Sorry.
I appreciate that. Ted, following on the air theme, you were in the air.
That was the start of quite a change for our country and for our people, but for me personally. Just a word of background. During 37 years of working on long-term economic and social development with the U.S. Agency for International Development, I repeatedly saw that our work was frustrated by local conflicts. And that's a whole nother story. But because of that, when I retired, I decided to specialize in conflict resolution and conflict prevention, and to add especially on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants into any peace process. On 9/11, I was on an Air France plane out of Paris, bound for Dulles Airport. And about 2.5 hours over the Atlantic, I looked out the window and I could see the sun was moving. And being a teetotaler, I said, this is not right. This is not a vision. And then I could feel that the plane was turning around in the middle of the Atlantic. And I said, there's no place to land out here. What's happening? And then maybe 5-10 minutes later, the pilot came on and he just said very simply, Dulles Airport is closed. We are returning to Paris. And of course, everybody on the plane started to say, well, why is this happening? What's happened? It's not weather, it's the wrong time of year. What's going on? And so for 2.5 hours, everybody just speculated, but nobody ever speculated that we were under a terrorist attack in the United States. When the plane landed and we came up the jetway and into the lobby, I have flown for 50 years and I've never been in a lobby of an airport where thousands of people, a little hard, were absolutely stone quiet, not moving, not running to catch an airplane, to get off an airplane. We're glued to television. And I walked over to one, which is about 4 or 5 people deep. And Anne, I watched. I'm glad you never watched. And I watched. And I cried. And the people around me were international people, even though my particular flight was going into Dulles, mainly Americans. But there was a bonding in that lobby. Sympathy for America, empathy for America, anger at what was happening as we watched the first and then the second plane go into the towers. We watched, and we shouldn't have been watching, and even to the point where the towers finally came down. There were people in that terminal that were angry, vengeful, confused. All of us were. And there were people who wanted to get on a plane and get home and see their loved ones, to know what was happening, to be part of our society, our country, our community. Others, almost like you said, Kevin, people didn't want to get on a plane again. We didn't know whether this was a one-off, whether it was only happening in the East Coast of America, whether it was happening all over the United States, whether it was happening all over the world. There was no reason why we would know that you could only get on a plane when you knew that it was safe for your work, Kevin, and continue on. I know that there were people who said, yes, I have a seat, but I'll give it up. If you need to get home, you take my seat, you go. There was a bonding there. And all the international people were just so supportive of the United States at that point. I watched it, and which I shouldn't have done, through the night in an airport hotel, and went through shock, went through anger, went to all kinds of emotions, sitting in there by myself in a little tiny room. But then in the next morning, I began to stop and focus. I was on that plane because I had just spent my 3rd consultancy to the government of Sierra Leone about demobilizing the Revolutionary United Front insurgents and rebels in Sierra Leone. And my thought turned to something that has happened in our country, in our society, in our world, that was so much bigger than the myopic view that I had of trying to disarm insurgents and rebels. I'd done it in a couple of countries already and focused on a national. And it finally dawned on me that the perspective had to now be how to combat international global terrorism, not just in a single country. And that at that moment, I made a commitment to myself to change the focus of my retirement work and spent the next 13 years not just focusing on disarmament and demobilization, reintegration of ex-combatants in a national insurgency, but then to research, to study, to understand why a sense of patriotism, a sense of responsibility for our country, a sense of responsibility in a representative government, that we take it seriously and we contribute whatever and wherever we could. Maureen, I know you have other people. I'll stop at that point and say that it did change our country, our society, and it's changed me. I would add one other last comment. I had been director for a United States government effort after the drought, during the drought of 84, 86 in Africa, and we created something called a famine early warning system. The Vice President of the United States said to us in that little group that created that, it still operates, can't you create a conflict early warning system? And for the next 4 months after I got back, we put together an interagency group to try and outline a conflict early warning system. And we tried it for about 6 months and it failed because of the stovepiping within our government agencies, the lack of sharing of information across. And out of 9/11 came a Homeland Security, and they took 11 of the 21 points that we had in our conflict early warning system and said, we've got to adopt some of this. And so the good news is there was a new sense of early warning, so this never could happen again. I'll stop there, turn it over to others, Maureen.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. I really appreciate those thoughts and the follow-on. Randy.
It's amazing how much emotion still comes out 20 years later. My life was not changed dramatically like Anne and Kevin and Ted's was, and Charles too. I was in West Virginia at a training center for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on 9/11. And ironically, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I was in a crisis communication course with about 300 of my colleagues from across the country. And I see one of the directors walking up to the podium and talking to the speaker. And he moved out of the way and she got there and she goes, I'm going to turn on something that's happening right now. And I want you all to just please remain calm, that this is going to be very disturbing, but this is what's happening right now. And the TV turned to CNN and we saw a smoking tower. And none of us really knew what was going on, except something about, a plane hit the tower. And then it shifted to that scene. Remember when George Bush was reading to kids? Aiden, you wouldn't know this, but George Bush was reading to some children in, I think, Florida, and these Secret Service guys walk up and whisper in his ear. And I instantly thought, no, I thought truly this is part of our crisis communication. This is what we're learning how to respond to in a crisis. And when I saw George Bush, I said, no, George Bush would never do a video for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He hates us. So then it started dawning on me after about 3 minutes that, oh crap, this is real. This is really happening. And when we watched the second plane hit the second tower, I saw about 10 of my colleagues jump out of their chairs and run out of the room. And that's the day I learned flight versus fight. And that's probably the most changing element for me, was watching how some of my colleagues reacted to this. I had several colleagues who literally went back to their rooms, packed up their car, and drove across the United States, Portland and Idaho, and various other places. And I just sat there stunned. That was about 9 a.m. And I decided, I'm going to fight this. I'm not going anywhere. So by 2:00 the afternoon, we were told we had to leave this West Shepherdstown Training Center, because it was, ironically, the emergency communication center for the Federal Reserve. And if you think of who was attacked on 9/11, it was Wall Street. It was our banking system. It was our economic system. So we all were put into a hotel that night and said, you're on your own. So here I am in West Virginia. I do have a rental car, but I can't get back to Nevada. So what do? I drive to Washington, D.C. to go stay with some friends. Bad job. Do not go to Washington, D.C. the day after a terrorist attack. And ironically, I stayed with my friend Anne, who is still the Washington Post cartoonist. And of course, she's going crazy. She's cartooning away, and I'm at her house. I go for a run out on the mall, and I run down by the Pentagon. I run down by the Lincoln Memorial, and I see the Pentagon smoking. All the flags around the Washington Monument are half staff. I come back and I said, I got to get out of here. And luckily, Dave and Ann had a house in Virginia, and I drove to Virginia and stayed there for 2 weeks. I was told I was on paid leave because I couldn't get home. And the only fortunate thing was there was no TV there, so I didn't watch all this drama. And but it lingered with me to some extent when I got back. And as Kevin talked about, I finally got a flight out about 2 weeks later from Roanoke. I think it was a Delta flight, and it took me 24 hours to get home. And it was the most solemn thing to get on that plane. You shook hands with the captain. You shook hands, you hugged the flight attendants. You thanked them for coming to work, because you know that was their industry that was so attacked. And it was the quietest flight, but it's nothing like we have now, nothing like Anne's experience recently in a flight. The camaraderie and the companionship and the compassion that we all had for each other on a plane flight was really amazing. It wasn't life-changing, and yet here I am 20 years later, still so emotional about it. And I think just the lesson learned from all of this is we've got to get back to being that one nation under God. We've got to get back to that America that trusts each other and trusts our government and appreciates each other as Americans. And Aiden, I wish you'd seen Washington, D.C. before 9/11, because Washington, D.C. was a wonderful place to visit and to work like I did for 10 years. But all these barriers that were put up and all of this stuff that's been put up since 9/11 has changed that town so much. And I hope that the next generation, as you're coming up, Aiden, really does appreciate the sacrifice that this country went through 20 years ago.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you. Thank you. Tony, you have a different perspective.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tony Shafton. In 2001, I was living in Northwest Indiana, just outside of Chicago. And I'm a writer. I had a book that was going to come out the next year, but that's not how I made money. I was at that time in the bead business. And I had a website where I sold, but most of my business was done traveling to bead shows around the country. A bead show was kind of a trade fair and art fair mixed together. So anyway, I had a show scheduled for the coming weekend in Denver. And because I had a cousin then living in Denver, I left a couple of days early. So the routine was to pack up the car the night before with all my kit and then leave first thing in the morning. And that's what I did on 9/11. At some point, getting toward the freeway, the interstate going west, outside of Chicago, I turned my radio on and I heard something about an airplane that went into a building. I didn't make much of it. I thought, okay, this is some Piper Cub or Cessna that's gone into a high rise somewhere. Okay, I turned off the radio. A little while later, I came to a rest stop and stopped there. And as I was walking into the rest stop, I heard two men, talking to each other in a way that people at public facilities don't normally talk to each other. It was like there was an immediacy and a connection between them. And they said something about the plane. And I began to get antsy at that point. So I went in, did my thing, came out, got on the road, turned on the radio again. And then I learned what had happened. This was at about probably around 8:30 in the morning, Midwest time. So it was 45 minutes perhaps after the attack began. So the rest of the day was spent still driving west, listening to the radio, making phone calls to see whether this damn show was still going to go on. It was, rather to my surprise. So I kept driving, kept going. This, of course, was before smartphones, so there were no images. Everything was verbal. Somewhere in the plains, I think it must have been in Nebraska, I stopped for the night, went into my room, turned on the television. And by then, I've never seen the images of the people falling. They'd been scrubbed by that point for the reasons that were mentioned earlier. And I've never gone and looked at those images, but like for all of us, those images are branded in my mind. So as I said, that's my story, and it really is not dramatic at all. The trauma of that day for me wasn't just the event that happened. The trauma was the fact that something that world-shattering had happened and I hadn't known about it. And I say it's a trauma because for 20 years, with exceptions for reasons I could name, like going camping or surgery, I've started every single day going to the news to find out whether something happened like that while I was unaware of it. So that's my story.
Thank you, Tony. It's important that we know there were 1,000, 100,000, 100 million stories, and everybody's is different and valuable and traumatic in its own way. So thank you for sharing. Aidan, we're going to let you close out this discussion.
First off, I just want to say thank you all to coming on here and sharing your stories. It's definitely something when you actually get to meet firsthand, especially from someone that's very was only one at the time during the attack, so I don't remember it cognizantly. I've only remembered what people have told me, but it's great to actually hear the emotional I guess connection behind everything, and how hearing people's individual stories is something that's truly important, I feel like, to hear, especially from my perspective of just viewing it from what as society we see 9/11 as being, and the implications that followed after everything. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for letting me speak. But yeah, so I guess I'll begin with where I was. I was one at the time. I was born in 2000, so I'm near one of the last few to actually have been alive during the time, which is a very interesting thing to think about. A few of my peers that I know weren't even alive at the time, so that's it's interesting to talk to them about everything involved with it and everything going forward. But yeah, so I was 1 year old at the time, and what I remember directly from my mom. It was a nice. She was taking me to daycare actually, just on a nice morning before she was headed off to work. And when she heard the news over the radio, just like you were saying, Anthony, that's when she first heard it on the car radio on the way to work. And at that moment, like it seemed like everything just stopped, and they called her, said, "Don't come into work, go home, stay with your family. Stuff is going on, and just turn on the news." And so that's what she did. And she said that it was a freaky time because nobody knew what, and that's what I think is fascinating compared to, and I guess that's how I look at it from like a society perspective, is back then information definitely did not travel as quick as it does today. And so I think that fact of it, where we were approaching the cusp of the internet world and the like fastest flow of information that we've ever had until in the world. And so what I think is fascinating is that aspect of not knowing what's happening, and that to me is the what. And it seems like there was a shared I guess shared bond in that nobody really knew what was happening, and that it seemed like at any moment something different could arise. And that's something that it's something that I could never really experience unless I was actually there, or unless I was going through it. And I just want to say thank you for telling your stories, because as somebody like me, it's important to hear these stories and actually be able to listen to them and communicate with them. Because for me, it's just what I've read in the books or seen from what people have told me on the internet or the videos itself. And but hearing those people are actually interacting with it and were involved in it, it's a lot. I guess it touches you a lot more, and it makes it a lot more personal and versus just reading about it. So I just want to say thank you all for speaking about it. But yeah.
Thank you, Aiden. For those of us who lived through it, we pass this torch to you and your generation. You grew up in a different world than we grew up in. There was a time we used to be able to walk freely through airports and kiss our loved ones at the gate and turn around and walk back out again. And all those things changed, but we are grateful for you and for your colleagues for taking on the mantle and for listening and for remembering for all of us. I'm very grateful to all the panelists. I'm gonna just move up everybody who is still with us and allow you to join, because part of what we learned in 9/11 is that we were not alone. And I think it's important that we all now know we're still not alone. So I have opened it up. All of you should now be able to join the circle. If you have any comments that you would like to add to our panelists, please do. Anthony, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to say something about anti-terrorism. Well before 9/11, I was an anti-war activist in Chicago in connection with the first Gulf War. And when 9/11 happened, I was supportive, definitely, of the military action in Afghanistan to take down Al-Qaeda. But when anti-terrorism got perverted into the second Gulf War, that's where I drew a line and became, again, for many years, an anti-war activist in Chicago. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. I know many of us have taken many different paths as a result of 9/11. And I'm grateful to everybody for sharing, for remembering, for keeping this in our hearts as we have moved forward for these last 20 years, making it a part of the lives of the people around us in ways they may not even realize. So we were all shaped by the events of that day, and we continue to be. And the fact that you were willing to share and that our NSF community was willing to join in this discussion, I think is an important part of healing and remembering and never forgetting, regardless of where we go from here and what our positions are on politically, for the military, and all these things. That's all part, as Randy very poignantly put it, it's all part of us as Americans. We aren't all the same. We have very different experiences, and we have shaped ourselves, our communities, and our country as a result. And we are all still here, and that's a testament to the fighting spirit that we have within us. So with that, if there are no comments, other comments, if anybody would like to say anything, either raise your hand or put a note in. Other than that, I would like to thank the panelists again and to thank all of our participants again.
Thank you.
Take care. Be safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.